Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Brittany and especially of its duchy. Culturally and politically, as you know, Brittany has always been one of the most distinctive regions in what would become as France. Recently I've resumed this European Historical Regions series, and we are focusing on France currently, and we have observed also, if you look at our medieval France playlist in general, on the composite nature, what we call today France as a nation, which is actually fitting basically to all the modern European nations. In many ways, world countries are almost completely like that by a certain degree. And essentially the territorial dominion was built gradually, and the history of Britain in this sense is quite exemplificative, by the Capetian monarchy during the late Middle Ages, to essentially bring under these other nations, we could call them. It's not a big word if you understand nation in the Latin and therefore the correct etymological meaning of the term. That in the case of Brittany is marked by the fact that, differently from most French regions, that aside from some Germanic one and the Occitanian part, were still, however, Gallo-Romans, right? The Occitanian part as well, with different degrees of Romanization, essentially. But the Breton area having a more markedly Celtic nature, right? And one that, in fact, Little Britain would give the name to the ancient Gallo-Roman province of Armorica. That, in fact, was one of the least Romanized provinces in Gaul, right? Was the theater of resistance also in the late Empire, as basically that Celtic fringe that we mostly come to know in the British islands, but was in fact a thing also in Armorica, in Galatia, in northern Iberia. And that, in fact, had one tape because essentially it was historically less, in part less developed, of course, but also closer to trade networks that were a bit more on the Atlantic side rather than the continental part, and so had remained just peripheral in a sense. The Atlantic routes were quite important, not just for trade but also for migration. It was an Iberian influence, in fact, in regions like Cornwall or Wales or even Ireland, and Armorica was fundamentally on the same Atlantic route between the two regions. Also, however, always importantly connected with central northern France altogether. So the history we're looking at today, medieval times, is the one of a Brittany essentially exposed to the influence / pressure at the end of the day of both the British Isles and France, and more in general, the more time went on, to the two major monarchies, the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England. And Brittany had become a duchy in the High Middle Ages and was united to the French crown only in 1532, when France had already established actually a political and cultural predominance. But that had never fundamentally tamed this millennium-long intermittent resistance from the Breton side against this, this domination, this eventually occupation. And this went in parallel, naturally, with the loss of also the most peculiar Breton culture, language, right? That's today is sadly all extinguishing, right? I know people that actually speak Breton, but they're mostly first of all, their first language is French in any case, and they can't really speak it as, their grandparents. And this is true for other areas of the Celtic fringe broadly meant. So it's important to remember these corners of Europe, because they tell stories that look at in depth at also the political and social construction of some of the most important countries that eventually incorporated them, and that made of these provinces part of the same and contributing to what we see today. So as we were saying before, in Roman times, the land was known as Armorica, and we know that it was the theater of very deep changes in late antiquity, albeit we don't have a great deal of documentation because the land was somewhat more primitive. However, and it's a bit of a puzzle for historians, for archaeologists, especially to define concretely the bond between, in fact, Armorica and Britannia, from which, in fact, the name of Brittany, of Bretagne, comes from. It's a name first encountered at the time of Gregory of Tours, 6th century. So in a time in which a Gallo-Roman Frankish bishop of the caliber of Gregory could say, that Armorica had already somewhat changed its nature, being kind of a little Britain. How, however, this had come to be practically, we don't understand. Because while migration from the British Isles surely brought settlers into the most important, especially in the three western civitates of Brittany, so Osis Miorum, Curiositarum, and Venetum, so corresponding respectively to Carré, later Brest, then Courseulles and Alais and Vannes. These areas underwent an important contraction, both demographically and economically, as it was happening during, roughly speaking, the migration era, and a sort of broader political and military reorganization. This in part was due to the same coastal raidings. I mean, Armorica, whatever we can attach the identity of the Bagaudae, these rebels against the empire, etc., and the pre-existing affinity of these Celtic lands, as we will see mostly with Cornwall, right, where probably they understood each other from the two shores of the channel fundamentally, even without these migrations, but because of pre-existing common Celtic background, was definitely a part of that, say, ordered, civilized world that was under attack from this broader northern piracy that included, already at the time, essentially the same phenomenon that we would see with the Viking era, right, where surely many Scandinavian pirates already at the time, Celtic ones from places like Ireland that had not been conquered by Rome, in spite of the influence they had remained, at least, were the areas from which part of further invasions and would start again against imperial territory. So the Romans had built real civitates there, right? And so, in part, Brittany would maintain that kind of administrative organization, right? And yet, the period of migration here is a period of contraction, exactly because of the damage suffered at the hands of the invaders. And it is true that the immigrants, the invaders, contributed to the culture of Brittany. It's evident from place names. The causes of this Celtic migration to Brittany is always said, well, it's mostly the Anglo-Saxons that pushed in Britain, and so the Celtic fringe in the west was formed, so part of these people decided to migrate in a place like Brittany that was relatively, autonomous even from the newly established Frankish Germanic power in the continent. But actually, this migration seems to have consistently predated the Anglo-Saxon invasions themselves. So we will not digress on this aspect. We just note that, of course, it was an important connection and contribution between Britain and Brittany. And in fact, philologists are not unanimous. They do not agree, really, on whether the similarities that we see in toponymy between the Breton names and the in fact the British and also naturally the same Gaulish ones, right? In general, and these two areas can be considered properly just like a matter of external influence, right? It's obvious that close affinities with Cornwall and Wales would have remained, right? For example, places with names in that meant Plu, which would be the plebs, by the way, Lan, Tre, etc., are still similar, in fact, to areas like the ones of the Celtic fringe of Britain, but they're also influenced, in fact, by Latin, evidently enough. And well, widespread, they may have been part of a broader common culture that predated also this movements of people. And the distribution of this similar toponyms, together with later formations in Loch Ker, is roughly west of the rivers Quesnel and Vilaine, and in the Guérande Peninsula. Also characteristic of the Breton-speaking region is the plethora of obscure local saints represented in church dedications, many of which recur in Wales and Cornwall. This aspect is important because, as we will see, the Celtic connection also with the insular missionaries in the broader evangelization of Europe would be used by the Bretons in competition, if not in opposition, to the Frankish Church, that, as you know, actually cooperated with the Irish missionaries, but was of different background, right? So the Bretons basically maintained probably more contact with those areas in the Irish Sea for, let's say, boosting not just this, they're the less urbanized, especially ecclesiastical model of the Gaelic missionaries, famously enough, right? It was essentially an exception in the West, because in the West, the Roman Catholic model was heavily centered in the city, with the diocese, the bishop, and the secular authority of the count. So in Francia, this had consistent work. In Britain, especially with decadence of cities largely, and the fact that never been a heavily urbanized area, the Irish model, mostly centered in monasteries, etc., worked kind of more. And secondly, it brought a form of spirituality that was kind of closer to the Celtic pagan pre-Christian world. I made a video about this. If I'm not wrong, it's titled Gaelic Spirituality at the Roots of Christian Europe, which is in part explaining the same process of evangelization in Ireland, etc., but also highlights how compromising this model was with the pre-existing pagan reality, and especially the one of these Celtic areas that, having been less developed, fundamentally were more kind of clanic, tribal-minded, and still regarded, like in the older mentality, the burial places of heroes as fundamentally the some sort of sacred place where, by venerating the dead warrior, they would derive some kind of magic power from it, and in the process of Christianization, many of these, in fact, obscure saints that had basically nothing to do with the Christian hagiographical tradition, at least the one that was kind of the more coming from the Roman reality, would be made saints with lots of characteristics that would make this kind of warrior nature living through them, but still, being, again, obscure also historically, not much because of a Christian suppression, rather because they were so, in fact, locally based in a tribal sense, and in areas that were not particularly, in fact, literate or documented, to essentially correspond to mostly to an oral memory that went lost anyway. It was not the one of for example, of Bannerly, but importantly for Britain, because it was for Brittany, because it would be the competitor to the what the Bretons would try to make, and in part succeed, the Archbishop of Dole, Tours, that originally would have the archdioceses of which would have encompassed the same Armorican, that instead the Bretons resisted to by creating kind of a church on their own, that in many ways managed to be autonomous from the in fact the French ones up to the end of the Middle Ages. And this stresses in any case the aforementioned similarities within the Celtic fringe. Also, we're not particularly documented for the Merovingian times. We generally say that Brittany was independent at this point. It was not part of the Frankish kingdom. It was not part of Neustria. It was something literally on its own. And the reason being that the Franks didn't have enough power, but mostly actually enough interest at that point to tame Armorica, which seemed like a wild area where they wouldn't need most of the time to invest their military fort, like it would actually happen later. And given that the Merovingians were mostly spending their existence fighting against each other, which was a much more profitable business, paradoxically, even though disintegrating their kingdom in the process. But and of which the Bretons in fact took advantage. But the Bretons weren't in fact any better in that regard. They were divided into several principalities with hereditary ruling families, mostly clanic tribal realities of some sort, installed also in this kind of post-Roman, still barely urbanized reality with some, in fact, administrative base. That was a very important thing, for, as you know, also in early medieval times, for continuing as some kind of organization of some kind of public authority. Merovingian sources comment on Breton raids into the Frankish-controlled counties of Nantes and Rennes that were important centers and the Bretons would extend their control on. And later Breton geographical traditions are unanimous in portraying early Breton churches as monastic communities founded by aristocratic or royal saints of Welsh or Irish descent. That is to stress the separation from the Merovingian church that tried unsuccessfully to assert its authority over them. So of course they were Christians, barely so in the forms that you can imagine in northwestern Europe during the Middle Ages, but still importantly, and still stressing, in fact, the private nature of these churches. I mean, the fact that such monastic, especially foundations, more important in a sense than the same churches, as we were saying before, because of insular motto, were a sort of private possession, which actually would be normal also in the Frankish world by a certain extent, except in the Frankish world were also many important, the diocese was more important overwhelmingly. In general, it was just a good investment to found a monastery and to just send part, your relatives to be abbots, abbesses, because the church enjoyed universally in these countries immunities that could and would. They were not in really hereditary assets, so that they would pass intact from generation to generation, or at least to abbot to abbot, and so. This would prevent the disintegration of the patrimonial assets that instead was typical, in fact, of those wars. I mean, look at the Franks that split the kingdom entire among their male sons after their father's death, causing the collapse, basically, of every generation of the unitary dominion. And so this difference in the ecclesiastical organization brought also the Carolingians to try to protect their ecclesiastical assets in the border area of Brittany that was becoming properly a militarized frontier. And the Carolingians also realized claims inherited from the Merovingians to hegemony over the Bretons, beginning with Pippin III, who sacked Vannes in 751-53. As you know, the Pippinians Arnulfings came to power essentially recompacting what had been the former Merovingian power, essentially also in the wake of the same authority model. Basically, everything the Carolingians had, they literally copied from the Merovingians, except they rejected ideologically or their legacy to legitimize their one. But they were the same means, and that included, importantly, the control on the church, right? And also with very violent means, as these ones. And the mid-8th century is probably the moment in which the border march between Neustria and Brittany was established. So this was a latitudinally stretching fortified frontier with several strongholds. I also put a map in here, and this was the norm at the frontiers of Carolingian power that was becoming an ever more hierarchical and stratified one, as you know, with the development of essentially the most effective military in Central Europe would subjugate all the surrounding countries, except in fact, with very few exceptions, one of Brittany in a way. Still was an, as we will see now, significant Frankish influence on the land. Given that these were kind of less developed peoples, that mostly would just base also their economy, their probably on raiding, right? That was especially in the rich agricultural Neustria a very important target for a warlike population like the one of the Bretons. And in fact, this was a bit the problem, that yes, you could even wage victorious campaigns to subdue this Celtic population, such as the one that the Franks waged in 786 and 799 under Charlemagne, by the way. But controlling the land was another thing. I mean, this is like in Roman times, right? The Franks, the Rhine always had the manpower, the military capacity to arrive, subjugate, exterminate, whatever, but it wouldn't last for long because the chances of kind of civilizing these peoples on the long run were quite low, and so resistance would go on and on and on. And so given also the events that happened to these dominations, it would always resume a power on its own. But naturally there was an influence of some sort, as war is always brings that kind of hybridization. During the 9th century, the Bretons revolted several times, especially at the moment of the collapse of Carolingian power. In the moments of greater Frankish stability, such as especially the beginning of the reign of Louis the Pious, 814-840, Brittany, there was a Frankish effort to integrate Brittany in the Carolingian Empire. And this is witnessed by imperial diplomas issued for Breton monasteries that, as you know, the monastery were of enormous importance essentially for the same mechanism we said before, especially for the Carolingian to establish some form of public authority that the Franks basically had never had, in spite of their power. And there are references also of Frankish counts in Breton-speaking areas, meaning that some Carolingian lords had come to rule, especially across the frontier, and on some Breton population, and also in agreement, in part with the Breton nobility, that there were connections, ties. In fact, the most important figure in this period is the Breton Nominee, who was appointed in 831 as imperial missus in Brittany. That is to say, he was kind of a ruler of the whole Brittany, on behalf of the Carolingians that naturally were just recognizing a powerful Breton lord in the land where he was present, by involving him and by co-opting him in their imperial policy. This was done with basically every aristocracy. Surely Nomino participated, I don't know, to the oath of Strasbourg, right? This, important moments of definition where properly the entire empire was being defined. That point was being split actually, but still, in fact, internationally figuring as part of the broader system in that hierarchy. Naturally, it was important for these Breton lords also to participate to Carolingian power. However, after that, Nomino's position changed. He initially supported Charles the Bald, that, as you know, ruled between 840 and 877 in what was Western Francia, essentially, with becoming the civil wars of 840-43. During which, in fact, Nomino took the advantage of Carolingian disorder to raid Western Neustria repeatedly, so at the border with Brittany, until his own death in 851. And in 2 years before his death, there was this important event that is still unclear by a certain degree, but Nomino expelled all the bishops of the Breton-speaking sees, that is, Vannes, Alais, Quimper, Saint-Paul, and Dole. We don't know the reason, in fact, because we don't know what the charges were against the bishops. It was not really an anti-pagan reaction, but it can be inscribed in this kind of, probable support for the Carolingian order, some sort of that, to also resume greater power, properly of the local, Brittonic government on these seas. Not very differently from what, the Carolingians had done, in fact, 1 century before, when recovering what some bishops during Merovingian times had usurped in terms of public prerogatives. It's just we were not documented enough. In any case, it was a way to strengthen Breton power at the expense of the stability of Frankish Gaul altogether. So much that also that Charles the Bald was badly defeated by the Bretons in 845 by Nomino, and 6 years later by Nomino's son and successor Erispo, ruling between 851-57. The Breton rule of these chiefs was pretty loose. I mean, they didn't control the entire Brittany, because there were many other lords that, albeit less powerful, were still altogether difficult to, if not impossible, properly to dislodge from their territory. So we are very far from any kind of political unity of Brittany altogether. Just the common interest was to remain more autonomous as possible, especially from the main imperial Carolingian power. Carolingian power that kind of compromised at that point with the Bretons by granting them some land in the same Neustria, marriage that brought with an alliance with the same Erispo, until the latter was assassinated by his son and successor Solomon, ruling between 857 874. And this was the time of disgregation of Western Francia in so many ways. Also, the Viking era had begun. There were many Neustrian magnates. At this point, we made many videos about how Charles the Bald tried to keep things together. The Capitulary of Pistre, other, important, in fact, also the Saint Quercy-sur-Oise was kind of part of the inheritance of the major fiefs. That was more important in general for post-Carolingian Europe altogether. But let's say this, the main problems that the Carolingian rulers were facing at that point were not much the external threat, like the second invasions, the Normans, etc. It was the same lack of a public authority in in the land. The entire Carolingian system was private, right? The most enlightened rulers like Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, other than just being lucky of having remained basically the only surviving male sons who could concentrate power in their hands legally, had also worked trying to build some form of public authority that only the church administration could provide. But as far as the secular government was concerned, it was at the end of the Frankish conquests that overstretched at some point, and the empire imploded as a consequence. No manpower, no possibility, no central capacity to control all the various enfeoffed lords. And Solomon took advantage of this by joining the revolts of the Neustrian magnates in 858-63. I mean, these people would side even with the Vikings at some point against the king. They didn't give a damn about the wall. Also, Solomon raided Neustria in 865-66. This brought, in a moment of weakness of the Western Frankish monarchy, to additional grants of imperial land in 863 and in 867. So just after, as a fait accompli, basically of the power that the Bretons had showed by invading Neustria, and extending, in fact, Breton rule yet farther into it. In fact, even the boundaries of Bretagne at this point are the modern ones are not actually are narrower than the ones that were at the time. Charles the Bold yielded the so-called Pays de Retz, where essentially I think it's the area between the rivers Vilaine and the Loire, that were important also because they controlled, in fact, the estuaries, pretty relevant for trade, etc. But the same counties of Nantes, Rennes, and what would later be incorporated actually into Norman land, because that proved actually more competent political dominion than Brittany, of Avranches, Coutances, and even the western Anjou. So quite an extended amount of territory. So if you consider it, even in post-Carolingian times, it's an impressive amount. And in that sense, the Franks had to thank the fact that the Bretons themselves were all politically fragmented, because such a territorial extent was not a few, and it was really a great political and strategical leverage, especially in in relation to the Norman invasions at this point that were ravaging France exactly from these rivers, from the Loire, from the Seine. And this would bring Solomon's reign to be virtually independent from Frankish control. A political line was symbolized by the attempt of Solomon to extract the Breton church from its dependence on the Archbishop of Tours, from which it had traditionally depended in the ecclesiastical districtuation, which was achieved by the creation of a Breton archbishopric at Dole. Also, Solomon, also quite of a name, biblically speaking, styled himself as Rex. At least in some Breton charters we find him titled like this. So this would give rise to the idea, some juridical claims later on in the Middle Ages by the Breton estates of the existence at some point of the High Middle Ages of a kingdom of Brittany. But naturally, it was kind of Rex was, as you know, even just in Latin, it's more like a title than the actual description of the existence of a kingdom per se, and especially at this time. But in any case, this shows, however, Solomon's power indeed as a Breton ruler in what should have been a Frankish Gaul. A Frankish gold that in fact is still present in Breton culture at this point. We see some records of the monastery of Radon in southeastern Brittany, so of course mostly from Frankish side direction, and also in the manuscripts and writings surviving from the Land of Venet on the west coast. However, Brittany, as many non-post-Carolingian realities, maintained some peculiar forms of administration that somewhat mirrored the different, in fact, ethnic and cultural tradition of the land. The Breton social organization was based on the community of the plebs, in Latin, in Breton plebs, in which the Machtern was a powerful figure, sort of head local chief. This is even especially in southeastern Brittany, that is still, however, one importantly exposed to Frankish influence in the 9th century. And yet, in the same area, it's the same development of the Radon Monastery's lordship that somewhat cancels this form, the trace of this administration, showing in this instance, in fact, that kind of the vassalic beneficiary models impressed by the Carolingians were gradually taken over and were advantageous actually for the same Breton aristocracy that could actually, concentrate much more power than it was traditional among the Bretons, were, as we've seen, to maintain mostly instead this kind of still tribal clanic mentality by a certain degree. So, Brittany has all this migration era influence. You see even in the, in the Red Dragon banner that is a bit like the one of Wales. It has surely connections with the Draco standard of the migration era that you find even in places like in Germany up to the 13th century. Even names like Alain, the Alans. Think about all the Brittonic cycle, the legions of King Arthur, this Celtic world somewhat frustrated by the Germanic invasion, but still, also containing some part of Roman legacy. The Alans, the Roman auxiliaries that would, because of their military and religious practices, give rise probably to the Legion of Arthur, reviving this, of this word in the stone, and in the generally revival of chivalry models, the heavily armored Alans and so on. Well, these probably lived in a sense, even in the Brittonic background. Alain I, ruling between 888 and 907, was the only one of Solomon's successor to manage to remain in control almost all over Brittany, by, in a sense, of course, nominally, not in a centralistic sense, in front of the Viking onslaught. In fact, Brittany was targeted heavily by the Norse piracy, so much that from 915 onwards, which is striking if you consider the what was happening in Normandy at the same time, the region was almost entirely in Viking hands. And the Breton leaders and churchmen fled the country, especially taking refuge in Anglo-Saxon England, in parts also like Cornwall, that, as we've seen, were kind of quite close culturally. Alain II, ruling between 936 and 952, returned from England in fact, in the same year of the beginning of his reign, taking back the land, including Nantes, Rennes, and the Pays de Retz, which is interesting because these were kind of the most exposed areas to Viking raids. So naturally, the Norse occupation, especially in these more this is present also in Ireland, right? Of course, it was a Norse trace there, but still was very difficult to actually control the entire place because of the same reasons we were saying before. The Norse were kind of more military advanced, but the local populace would just resist, and there were no means really to centralize in the area, not even for the locals. You can imagine for some external powers, at least they had their central power elsewhere. But naturally, Viking raids continued, especially from Normandy. At this point began to harass Brittany in many ways until the beginning of the 11th century. So these weren't quite Vikings anymore, but were basically their own descendants settled in the lower Seine Valley by the Western Frankish kings and effectively becoming, if not a Frankish pawn, because they always kind of struggled and achieved actually autonomy, but still kind of a Frankish power at that point on Austrian soil that was trying actually to take over Bretagne. Alain II began to restore the Breton church, and probably he founded two important bishoprics that would acquire great relevance, in fact, during the following centuries. That is Saint-Brieuc and Tréguier. Alain II duchy had much in common with the 10th century territorial principalities, with a basis, in fact, in Carolingian administrative practices that at this point had somewhat taken over after especially the Iron century of the hardest moment of the second invasions had somewhat depleted further that kind of middle egalitarian class, we could call it in this way, that could have been at the base of some Celtic political social survival traditionally in the land. And a more dynastic principle, a more properly feudal one, was emerging, with possibilities of concentrating power, also extending it with more powerful seigneuries over the land. By the end of the 10th century, Alain II's successors had factually lost the ducal title, right? That in these centuries had gone back and forth. I mean, being called a dux, whatever, was kind of could be a semi-official styling from the Carolingian side, could be just a self-titling of the local rulers. It simply meant it stressed the military bias of these people, as opposed to the Frankish one, mostly ruled from counties, right? The ducal title was mostly entrusted to areas of frontier, with powers that had a markedly strategic function and, were involved, in fact, in military activities. And, the Bretons would boast it, given their warlike tradition. The Bretons were excellent horsemen, by the way. They were the ones who taught, basically, the Normans how to ride. Also the Western Franks did it to their ornaments, but, they had also this interesting Western school in Brittany. That's a bit of a Celtic bias that in Gaul, especially traditionally, the nobility, since pre-Roman times, had been kind of obsessed with. And this meant a lot, even for the development of the heavier cavalry. That meant, before, remember what we were saying about the Sarmatian legacy, this thing. Of course, the Bretons actually had kind of probably a lighter cavalry, given that their feudal system was more imperfect compared to the Frankish one, so they could concentrate less wealth in a single hand, but let's say still knowing how to fight in a more guerrilla style what was important, as also witnessed by, somebody like Harold Godwinson, and the way he could switch to be a Norman knight when fighting in England, and kind of adapting to skirmishing tactics when fighting against the Welsh, as a matter of fact, even though we're talking about Celtic connections with Bretagne. In fact, there was a Breton-Norman war that went on for some time. It's an important time, and a general rivalry that continued on. And generally speaking, Normandy, because of its feudalization, was a bit the future, was in fact the one that would take over and kind of remodel along the Western Frankish style, the Kingdom of England, and all these things. So the Britons still remained a bit isolated in like the Celtic fringe, in fact, in the process of these changes. However, they also developed their own, in fact, seigneurial system. As we were saying before, the 10th century had not gone without encapsulation like in many other regions in Europe. So they built motte and bailey castles that would literally redraw the political geography of Brittany. Throughout the later 10th and 11th century, the counts of Rennes and of Nantes were caught up in the territorial ambitions of the counts of Blois and of Angers. So we're talking about the southeastern frontier. Also because they were essentially struggling over it was a Loire seigneury, so was developing fast in this moment of demographic and economic revival of Europe. And also, more importantly, actually, with the Dukes of Normandy. They were compacting, as you know, a very coherent and cohesive political domination in the lower Seine Valley and pushing west, because fundamentally that was the main direction of Norman expansion, especially in later times, exactly in part because of the political fragmentation of Brittany that favored this kind of Norman infiltration. In fact, William the First, William the Conqueror, had also, famously enough, Breton vassals that participated to the invasion of England in 1066. There were also Flemish, it was a massive thing, and even the English nobility, in part, if I'm not wrong, probably even the Stuarts, right? Given that they were settled, there was all a time of that the Stuarts were essentially they were claiming, at least, to be descending from the first settlers of William the Conqueror of Breton, descent in the borders, northwestern border with Scotland, of which the country that would have become eventually kings, as you know. Because there was all a fashion in the later, like in the 12th, 13th century, for all these English nobility to claim to have had ancestors among the first feudatories that William the Conqueror had settled in the Anglo-Saxon lands after the conquest. And aside from the genealogical links that might have been invented, whatever, but still, yes, the Breton component in the conquest of England was quite important. And William, intelligently enough, settled many of these Bretons, mostly in the southwestern lands of England, in places like Cornwall, because he recognized the greater cultural affinity existing between these Cornwall, kind of basically barely anglicized, but still formerly Celtic Romano-Brittonic land, right? It was similar to Bretagne. There were also important figures. For example, the honor of Richmond was granted to the sons of Eudo de Penthièvre, Uncle Conan II, who ruled, in fact, between 1040 and 1066, and would remain in the hands of the Breton ducal family until 1399. And this genealogical descendants is actually instead well documented. In the process, as you understand, the Normans, having dramatically increased their power with England and later, as we will see now with the Angevin Empire, the end of the Normans actually, with the Angevins, but we're talking, as you understand, all areas that border Brittany, kind of intensified, in fact, the Anglo-Norman and the Angevin lordship over the land, formally. This happened, for example, under the last Norman ruler, Anglo-Norman ruler Henry I, that, as you know, had a kind of a centralistic policy, but also Henry II, so we're talking about the Plantagenets now, integrated Brittany fully into the Angevin Empire. And this was actually a beneficial thing because it allowed, from the top of the fact of the English power, to kind of strengthen the political cohesion of traditionally, in fact, more fragmented land like Brittany. In 1166, Constance was that was the infant daughter of Henry's vassal Duke Conan IV, ruling between 1155 to 66, was betrothed to Henry II's young son Geoffrey Geoffroy, that gave the Angevin ruler the excuse to rule Brittany directly until Geoffroy came of age in 1181. And there was a continuity, in fact, of a solid rule also from Henry to Geoffroy, and the Duchess Constance, who died in 1201, which definitely strengthened ducal power. Revolts were crushed bloodily. Ducal administration was established in a similar fashion as was being formed in the Angevin Empire. It was one, in fact, most politically administratively advanced in Europe, right? Especially for the solidity of its, let's say, centralizing power. The Assize of Count Geoffrey in 1185 changed rules of inheritance, by the way, to reduce the fragmentation of the fiefs and therefore to ensure military service in a effective way. It was the greatest problem to have to compact, to consolidate a hierarchy, more concentrated power, to manage to levy as many knights as possible that were at this point were dominating the western battlefields, and this would increase, in fact, the authority and the central power of the local lords. Henry II of England also tried to revive the claim for a separate Breton archbishopric, but this was, say, nullified by Innocent III in 1199, that put an end historically to those claims as an archbishopric, independently from the direct channel that the papacy still maintained, though, for its own interest, with the Breton Church, that was, as we will see now, with the development of the Duchy, Brittany was always very difficult to be directly controlled by the French. So in general, also Gallicanism by the end of the 13th century was, brought the papacy to be wary of the Caesar-papistic claims of the French kings by making leverage on the autonomy, at least of the Breton Church. Was the only one that effectively escaped at that point the royal control within the country. And interestingly enough, Brittany had maintained throughout all this time, with the territorial extent, so the Breton West plus the counties of Radon and Nantes, under the Angevin rulers, that therefore cared about the land to maintain a political compaction, be a very effective pawn in northwestern France. So, as you know, between the end of the 13th, the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century, things started to go rough for the Angevins, as Richard Lionheart was captured during a return of the Crusade, and the assassination of Arthur in 1203. It was the posthumous son of the aforementioned Geoffroy, brought to the French resume their offensive against the Angevin held areas, especially under Philip Augustus, which was aiming definitely at bringing Bretagne, as well as the other Angevin territories, under Capetian influence. In 1212, Philip married the Breton heiress Ellie to his relative Pierre Mauclerc, who essentially remained in charge in Brittany through a liege homage to the king. So with a higher bond that, however, even after the French reconquest, the definitive one after 1214 of almost all the Angevin territories in France, as you know, including, at least as a sphere of influence, Brittany, kind of swung right in allegiance between England and France still, showing how even a Capetian alleged trustee could exploit the actual Breton power and autonomy to play the game between a very strong France, as a matter of fact, and still kind of a frustrated England that, however, could still make and would continue to make in the following centuries political leverage on the Capetians true. And with the help of French-trained administrators, Mauclerc, who ruled between 1212 and 1237, and also his son Jean I, 1237, 1286, worked energically and relentlessly to strengthen the ducal demesne revenues, to boost the judicial fiscal administration, to curtail seigneurial independence, and to assert control over the church in Britain. The church policy was important, especially for the episcopal and appointments and temporalities. This is thus a moment of a broader French prosperity. They saw the compaction of important territories within France. It's been a sort of states on their own. We made the video on the Duchy of Burgundy that had a similar story. Same goes for actually the Duchy of Brittany, that even for the first time kind of was becoming more powerful than the same Normandy, that instead under the Capetians lost great part of its political activity because it was easier to control in general, if it did maintain some kind of autonomy on its own. But Brittany remained kind of always eccentric, and albeit within the French orbit, kind of escaped direct Capetian rule. Even under these branches that naturally, as in feudal times, happens all the time, when they are entrusted with these fiefs, are trying essentially to strengthen their own lineage and dynasty claims and so on. It's like the Burgundian branch later on. These were, in the case of Brittany, the rulers would become also Breton in part, right, by spirit. But if you think even about the Duchy of Burgundy, these were purely French Capetians, and but what that still Capetians, by the way, that still would also fight for, in a sense, disgregating France, the English invasion. So great moments of expansion eventually have to bring to moments of checking and regulation, etc. And this is what happened during and after the 100 Years' War from the French side. In fact, by the 14th century, the Breton ducal power was established and effective as a household-based polity, with a network of local officials put in place in the administration, and therefore a very updated power for the times beings. And this had been possible also with the broader development of European economy and demographics in the 12th to 13th century, right? The Cistercians and the Hospitallers contributed to the process of fortification, of land clearance and exploitation in the land directed by the lord. New urban markets were founded. As we were saying at the beginning of the video, Brittany was in an important position on the Atlantic routes. It had some important assets, such as, for example, the salt from the Guérin Peninsula, as you know, was a very precious goods at the time for preserving food. It imported wine from Burgundy, for the nobility elite, like as a luxury product. The Caen stone that could take from Normandy to further fortify the land. And this encouraged also the growth of ports, especially in the French-speaking eastern part of Brittany, that was naturally also the more exposed to French language and culture. It was the closer to the Loire, so it had kind of the most international connections in this regard. Brittany traded extensively up to Gascony, Portugal, Flanders, and naturally southern England, especially Cornwall, where this Breton-Cornish partnership had never come less, right, given the mutually intelligible languages and the cultural community that had remained up to that point. These are the moments also. Think about the Breton cycle in success in French and thus Western European literature altogether. It was an important revival, probably of culture from these areas that spread all over. And there were some handcrafts such as canvas, leather products that the Bretons exported. So overall, an important development. And this, however, brought at the same time an unavoidable Frenchization of the land. Frankification, I don't know how to say it in English, especially in the East, as you understand, given that the same Breton aristocracy had adopted the French language and culture since the 11th century, right? That's the moment properly in which the military class that came to rule, or the post-Carolingian Europe, shared kind of universal values that were nurtured mostly from the cradle of Neustria, what would become properly what had been the Western Frankish kingdom at that time. And the elites are obviously the most international because they're the ones to make business on a larger scale, and so it was obvious that they would kind of fit the broader French culture that was at that point overflowing, especially by the 13th century everywhere, like all over Western Europe and beyond, right? Even in the Balkans, in the Near East and Mediterranean, I mean, it was dominating, and so Britain was just next door. They would be interested in that as well. And French and Latin essentially were the languages of administration by now, Breton being spoken only at a low status level. So, as we were saying before, actually the people would keep speaking this Celtic language, but in a consistent literary tradition, it remained only in the church for preaching, and Breton literature survives from the 15th century onward, in fact, mostly in the devotional production, but not much in other fields, were dominated at that point by French and Latin. Now, when Jean II, who ruled as Duke of Brittany between 1286 to 1305, was created peer of France, 1297, Brittany was opened to an even greater degree of French cultural influence and royal control. Essentially, the Duke got his right to the ducal title finally recognized by the French royal chancellor. So, at this point, Brittany became properly part of the fully part of the French politics and administration. As a consequence, military service was expected of the Breton Duke. Breton cases were heard in the royal parliament. Royal ordinances were extended to Brittany, and although the ducal right to strike coin was recognized by the French crown, it was carefully monitored lest royal coinage be affected. So naturally it was part of a broader negotiation in this ever larger seigneury that France had become as the strongest power in Europe, that where, however, the Bretons still maintain, of course, a degree of autonomy that they would play with politically. In fact, as you know, the early 14th century was a moment of crisis for France, at least a moment of decline, paving the road to the major, in fact, crack during the 100 Years' War. And the Bretons, albeit having acquired this new status in the French kingdom, still kind of kept royal intervention restricted in their land. Ducal administrators developed notions of the duke's inalienable regalian rights that were validated, as we were saying before, on the basis of this alleged independent Breton kingdom that was believed to have existed in the High Middle Ages, which was a myth, but it helped ideologically to maintain a distance and even some kind of competition with the French kings, right, for Breton autonomy. So the important break between France and Brittany occurred again when Jean III died in 1341, leaving a disputed ducal succession. So this would give rise to the, in fact, war of Breton succession that for the rest of the Middle Ages would bring a great, political turmoil, which intertwined naturally with the 100 Years' War, as there were essentially two sides as claimants to the ducal throne of Brittany that were backed respectively by France and England. In the Arrêt de Conflans of 1341, Philip VI of France ruled in favor of Jeanne de Penthièvre and her husband, Philip's nephew, Charles de Blois, in preference to the late Duke's half-brother, Jean de Montfort. De Montfort would be the ones also gave the coat of arms of Brittany, the famous black and white one. Montfort died in 1345. And at this point, Edward III of England intervened as guardian of Montfort's son, the future Jean IV was also Earl of Richmond, by the way, so the aforementioned Breton connection still survived across the channel, also with the English connection. The Breton Civil War went on effectively between 1341 and 1364. And here it was a proxy war, in fact, between the English and the French in Britain and even outside at some point. Charles de Blois was defeated at the Battle of Auray in 1364, where he also found his death. And this brought Charles V of France to recognize the Montfort claim at that point and left the duchy on its own, given that Brittany was fundamentally exhausted at that point after the ravages, the coastal pillaging, essentially the collapse of central authority that the war had brought in the land. Essentially it was a mess there. Everybody kind of exacted arbitrary tolls, etc. So it was a quite fragmented situation. Thus, Jean IV, ruling between 1364 and 99, had this very delicate task of balancing the economic advantages at that point of friendly relations with the Kingdom of England, and still the need to keep on cordial terms with the Kingdom of France, in a quite troubled situation. In Jean IV and his son Jean V, the latter ruling between 1399 and 1442, were heavily involved, as you realize, in the very ungrateful task of trying to reassert the ducal authority in Brittany, that after the civil war had basically been forfeited among the Breton aristocracy that didn't want to give it back. And the thorniest side of this was that among the Breton aristocracy still lived the Penthièvres, together with their claim to the ducal title, and that received, in fact, many support by local noblemen, and also the same French crown that at this point, by the way, during the 100 Years' War, served itself of very important Breton figures, such as Bertrand du Guesclin, Olivier de Clisson, and Arthur de Richemont, among the others. So there were a lot of Bretons at that point in service properly of the French crown that were trying to oust the Montfort and reassert a pro-French side in the land. And this went in parallel with the swings of the 100 Years' War and the various political and strategical turns of the same. And this situation, however, still produced some sort of further autonomization of Brittany, because the duchy regalian prerogatives, for example, were stressed further, fostering even a sense of Breton national identity. Because after all, the system had maintained a good skeleton, a good administration, right? And this, even the broader refeudalization of Brittany that went in parallel generally with the one of Europe after the crisis of the mid-14th century, and so the rise at the end of the day of the nobility, in spite of their clashes based on dynastic claims, still had elevated the aristocracy over the masses that were ever more impoverished. So the Breton dukes, for example, adopted a sort of royal ceremonial at this point. They refused liege homage with France, which would have tied them further to the Valois. And there were also frequent meetings of the Breton estates that had an advisory, a legislative, and until 1492 also a judicial body that backed ducal sovereignty in this kind of an independentistic direction. In a similar way, as we were saying before, the Breton church was separated from the French one. The Breton clergy did not attend, in fact, the French ecclesiastical assemblies. The pragmatic sanction of Bourges, in which the French king had declared himself as guardian of the French church altogether, was not applicated to Brittany. As a consequence, the popes negotiated directly with the Breton church, also appointed only Bretons to Breton benefices, so to strengthen in that sense the papal influence over France through Bretagne. Also, Nantes opened in 1460 its university, symbolizing Brittany's independence as a national country. And objectively, at this point, the duchy was not even small, as we've seen, so it was an important landmass, even just, an anomaly in what was becoming, especially with the English defeat in the 100 Years' War and the ensuing French political and territorial compaction in a national sense, which was bringing France after the crisis again as the most powerful country in Europe. This northwestern peninsula that still resisted as a kind of thing on its own, developing properly a sense of itself, of its culture, its own tradition, etc. At the peak of regalian claims was under the reign of the incompetent and untrustworthy Duke François II, 1458-88, who actually fought against France for independence under Louis the 11th and Charles the 8th. And especially after participating in several of the other French princes' revolts, by the way, against Louis the 11th. And it's at this point that Francois sought also a bit of a greater international support, as France was anyway growing power all around. These were sought with the Habsburgs, Maximilian of Austria, with England, of course, with Edward IV. At this point, in fact, the empire in England was still toying with some kind of invasion of France, even after the 100 Years' War. However, in 1480, French King Louis XI bought out the Penthièvre claim to the Dutch, and attracted, by the way, disconnected Breton nobles into his service, fueling thus kind of another division within the Duchy from the external. Now, when Charles VIII finally attacked Brittany in 1488 with the aim of conquering it, Francois II was effectively without resources, and consequently also without external support from his allies, his subjects, and he concluded peace, dying shortly afterwards, leaving as heir his daughter Anne de Bretagne, who ruled as Duchess of Brittany from 1488 to 1514. There were some here, there was all the question of Westphalian law had been adjusted, was keeping, also the French were controlling this aspect, exactly because they were interested, especially properly in the female succession of Brittany. And Anne also initially even continued the war for another 3 years against France herself. However, famously enough, the peace treaty included the marriage of the same Duchess, first to Charles VIII, King of France, in the same 1491, then to Louis the 12th, 1499, after the former's husband's death. And we can say that under Louis the 12th there was this actual formal stipulation that of the terms that would at that point unavoidably incorporate the Breton Duchy into the Kingdom of France. And it would not be until Henry III of France that a French king would effectively sum up the titles, in fact, of Kingdom of France and of Duchy of Brittany. There had been Francis, his brother, for example, that died. We should have become king, but he was already heir of he was already Duke of Brittany, but not king yet, from his mother Claude de France, that was the daughter, by the way, of Anne of Bretagne and of Louis the 12th. She had been married to Francis I of Valois, Angoulême, and so the ducal prerogatives were maintained. It essentially flowed into the French royal line anyway, but formally, in fact, it's not until 1532 that the Breton estates voted for perpetual union with France, so that this would bring to the incorporation in the French kingdom. And yet, as it was, part of the Ancien Regime at the time, the judicial, fiscal, and ecclesiastical liberties of Brittany were safeguarded. So much that the last Duke of Brittany was factually the grandson of the Grand Dauphin, in turn the son of Louis XIV, who died of measles together with his father in 1712. A pretty heavy blow for the old Sun King. So that Brittany, in many ways, unlike, for example, Normandy, that had greater power at some point, but this had been more easily swallowed by French domination, kind of maintained this character on its own, these prerogatives on its own, that eventually were disbanded in 1792 completely with the French Revolution and everything that followed with the French republics, etc. And this is a testament to in fact, the very long, the half millennium long struggle of Brittany against the incorporation from outside powers that, in fact, as a culture, long outlived the loss of political independence. And you know that Brittany, even if you think about the Vendée in the south, were areas that traditionally would still kind of be more edgy in the broader process. Paradoxically, during the revolution, this were the monarchic side that didn't like the novelty from Paris, right? So that also still some British landings, interference in France, etc. As other lands. But let's say these territories that in a sense lived a bit more romantically in the outside of the heat of modernity and echoing still in their shores, in their forests, that older kind of ancestral, probably Celtic, Romano-Gallic part identity that survived in a way to the same Germanic invasions that historically molded Europe in their political and military map in a way. And we will keep talking about Brittany because it's like one of those lands, in fact, that you never stop really pointing out interesting stuff about. I'm glad we covered it in the series about European historical regions. For today, I stop it here. However, I wish you a happy Easter, by the way, if you're a Western Christian. And if you like this video, please share it. Otherwise, just leave a thumb up or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.